Thank you, Nick, and it's great to be with you. Unfortunately, due to some private incidents, I'm only here now, so I'm afraid I cannot introduce this last session by building a nice bridge from the earlier sessions till this moment, so I will give you a more general introduction to this last block of today. Looking at the three papers that are going to be presented and the three types of research, I was thinking we're really going into the museum machine in a way with this last block, whereby in a way we're going to kind of, hopefully or probably kind of turn over some of the basic assumptions on which this institution was founded. I myself am a curator of collections in the museum, and looking at the research proposals and the research that was delivered, I was reminded of kind of this, let's say, presupposition that was present in the museum when it started, in a sense that, let's say, if you think about the origin of the museum, you kind of have in mind an almost empty, endless space on which you could order endless amounts of artworks which were inspected by an equally, let's say, abstract and universal subject that looks at all these objects and can somehow, out of some miraculous force of epistemology, draw connections between these objects and kind of get knowledge out of them. Maybe that is what classical museum research is about, or not so much about, but maybe what's kind of the presuppositions that underlie it. If you read the research proposals of this last block, you are kind of confronted with all the, let's say, prejudices that are, let's say, have sneaked into that presupposition, in the sense that, of course, we know that this space is certainly not neutral, and that it has a color and it's white, and that white color is not neutral. That the subject that supposedly neutrally, objectively observing these objects is also not neutral and is embodied, has a gender, and who knows what gender, and that if we don't identify that gender, it's a habit of this culture to think of it as a he or a him. And I have the feeling, looking at the three papers that are going to be presented, that in a way this, let's say, foundational notion of the museum and its practice, because in the end then this trades into spaces that then in a way are the neutral canvases on which these seemingly, let's say, specific objects are placed to be inspected by the seemingly neutral observer, are going to be tested severely. They're going to be tested by the type of bodies that are going to inspect these objects, but also by the types of technologies that are used to, let's say, further this museum institution, and by the rhythms and the time of this museum, by the sound of this museum. So all these questions, I think, will appear, and hopefully in an interrelated or entangled manner, because the first presentation by Ana Sol Gonzalez, who identifies as a she and a her, is already focusing especially on this entanglement of the fact that this seemingly objective and neutral separation between subject and object is maybe one of the founding catastrophes of, let's say, Western culture, and something that maybe should be tested through feminist pedagogies and using different notions like diffraction. So I'm very curious to hear this paper. It's called Meaningful Matter Testing Feminist Pedagogies in the Exhibition Space. And Anna is an independent curator holding a PhD at the Museum and Gallery Studies of the University of St. Andrews and an MA in Curating and Contemporary Art from the University of Essex. And her doctoral dissertation is titled Inherent Pedagogies, Critical Approaches to Exhibition Making in the 2000s. And I'm very curious to hear what you're going to tell us. So welcome to the stage.
Thank you, Stephen. Okay, so my project concentrates on the potential of feminist materialist pedagogies to examine and reimagine conventional hierarchies between curators, works, and visitors within the exhibition space, and specifically within the dynamics of the Benaves contemporary art collection displayed away beyond art. Feminist materialist pedagogies are concerned with the complex relations between objects and subjects, matter and meaning. This perspective attends to the positioning of all actors involved in the learning process, with particular emphasis on objects and environments. Today, I will introduce the notion of diffraction and diffractive pedagogies as the key methodological tools of the project. Then I will discuss the activities conducted so far. First, a movement as learning session with the museum's volunteers, and second, a seminar session with the curatorial and mediation teams, in which we focused on questioning and rethinking the kinds of knowledge production and meaning-making processes that the museum's collection displays put forward. And to conclude, I will summarize the findings of the project and elaborate on the principles and strategies that feminist pedagogies can contribute to exhibition making. Now, I ask you to bear with me for a bit. I need to tell you a bit of quantum physics, which is not easy as an art historian, but I'll do my best to get to the point. Physicist and feminist theorist Karen Barad draws from Niels Bohr's quantum mechanics challenge to the principles of classical physics, some of which are fundamental to the Western worldview. Bohr developed the idea of complementarity, also known as wave-particle duality, from his double-slit experiment in which he observed the electron's wave and particle properties. Depending on the circumstances, the electron behaved as a particle, so a material entity, or as a wave, a disturbance. The double-slit experiment demonstrated that the apparatus disturbs the object. Therefore, it is impossible to distinguish between the object's behavior and its interaction with the measuring instrument. Now, this finding is highly significant because it establishes the inseparability between the observed and the observer, an assertion that directly confronts classical Newtonian physics. Barad draws from the quantum understanding of diffraction as a notion that troubles dichotomies, to rethink identity, quote, not as essence, fixity, or givenness, but a contingent iterative performativity, thereby reworking this alleged conflict into an understanding of difference not as an absolute boundary between object and subject, but rather as the effects of enacted causes. End of quote. In her writing, Barad applies diffractive analysis and considers, for example, queer and mestiza identities, identifying as both male and female, black and white, in relation to quantum physics. From the quantum understanding of diffraction, knowledge emerges from the relation between matter and discourse in a process in which knower and the known are undifferentiated. Educators, learners, objects, and environments, or if we think of the museum, curators, visitors, artworks, and exhibitions, everyone and everything are co-implicated and embodied in the process. This model involves, then, looking into the mutuality that exists between our sensory apparatus and material things. In the context of the museum, Sandra Dudley observes that the sensible, physical characteristics of the thing, the artwork, trigger and thus contribute to the viewer's sensory perceptions, which in turn trigger emotional and cognitive associations, which together with the physical characteristics could be said to constitute the object's materiality. Materiality then is about not solely meaning nor simply physical form, but the dynamic interaction of both with our sensory experience. Deep mutuality exists between our sensory apparatus and material things. Dudley underlines the overwhelmingly ocular-centric approach to museum display, which prioritizes distance over intimacy. She draws attention to the need of moving away from the modernist human imposition of meaning onto objects towards meaning that emerges from the interactions between objects and subjects. Pedagogically, this requires letting go of the conception of completed knowledge and work instead with knowledge in the making via the body's experience and presence in the exhibition space. Now, diffractive pedagogies contest the conventional understanding of learning as a process of transferring knowledge that typically pays no attention to the physicality of learning. This approach calls into question the epistemological relegation of the body, the feminine, and the material to the opposite side of male rationality. Instead, it considers the body as a site of learning and looks at the relations of bodies between each other and their environment, particularly in spaces that disregard the body, such as the university or often the museum. Introducing an experimental pedagogical approach like this involves facing strong preconceptions of the kind of knowledge that is expected to be gained from exhibitions. The process involves challenging and transforming the conception of legitimate knowledge, as well as departing from the Cartesian dichotomy between mind and body. Some of the central questions of the project include how to attend to the uncomfortable, unthought, and undetermined in our encounter with art, how to draw attention to the physicality of learning, reject the primacy of discourse and language, and look into the meaningfulness of body's movement across the exhibition space, how to encourage connections and bifurcations rather than rational explanation. The project seeks to build on the museum's experimental programming, such as play, which invited visitors to play specific roles and try out different ways of experiencing art. Another relevant example is Sarah Wilke's Point Pond, which reflected on bodies in habitation and movement through public space. In particular, Point studied how people position themselves in front of an artwork and the restriction of their movements by social codes, rules, and the invisible laws of public space. Importantly, it looked for ways of repositioning the body to overcome these limitations. And now the museum, with the multisensory museum, it's approaching the building from a sensory perspective. So my project considers some of these questions from the point of view of learning and pedagogy, and looks for strategies to move away from traditional modernist display and engage instead with notions of corporeal mediation, decolonial, and demodern thinking. The sessions on movement as learning, developed in collaboration with Marieke Verbern, address the problem of the body as a site of learning. With the museum volunteers, we started by moving between postures and gestures that correspond to the feelings of certainty and uncertainty. Each participant suggested their own movements for the group to try out. Then we started working with scales, so smaller or larger movements, and choreographic scaffolding to bring them together. Uncertainty postures were mostly closed down and unstable, while certainty positions could be described as stable and confident. We also noticed that the Dutch word for uncertainty, onzekerheid, if I'm pronouncing that right, denotes insecurity. It was difficult to stop ourselves from verbally interpreting postures and movements and keep thinking through the body. To do so, we built our collective choreography by following each other's movements in silence. A second part of the exercise consisted of participants working in pairs, trying out postures and gestures that corresponded to activity and passivity in relation to specific works and displays of their choosing. Here, a participant engages with Sheila Gauda's Protest My Son by mimicking the postures and gestures within the image and joining the scene of protest. In contrast, for her passive posture, she has stepped aside to lean at the wall and look at the work. Then this is participant's passive posture in relation to Céline Condorelli's The Bottom Line and Fusuna Onor's Let's Meet at the Orient, although it turned out to be quite active, as looking from the bottom up allowed them to notice other work details. Their active movement consisted of running in circles inside, which also caused the curtain to flutter. And here we have the group joining in. Others proposed going through the room very quickly, glancing at each of the works. We concluded the session by drawing attention to our need of interpretive explanatory closure. Instead, we focused on questioning this expectation and wondered what and how we can learn by leaving things open and allowing space for indeterminacy. The session involved facing preconceptions about the kinds of learning and behavior expected at the museum, as well as questioning what legitimate knowledge looks and feels like. As a diffractive pedagogical strategy, movement as learning investigates the body as discourse, in which each move is meaningful as an embodied concept. The exercise aims to unlearn disembodied learning by means of thinking in action and unsettle the distinction between inner and outer experience. The second section consisted of a seminar with the curatorial and mediation teams. Our discussion was based on an excerpt from Karen Barat's book, Meeting the Universe Halfway, in which she discusses the shift from representationalism to a performative framework. Following Bohr's premise that we are part of the nature that we seek to understand, Barat distinguishes between representationalism's strict boundary between subject and object, and performativity's attention to the emergence of subject and object through their interactions. From, on the one hand, the understanding of words and things as separate entities, to, on the other, the examination of material discursive phenomena. From the clear distinction between knower and the known and the notion of distanced objective learning, to the knower as part of and directly engaging with the world. I propose to read this text with Irit Rogoff and Beatrice von Bismarck's distinction between curating and the curatorial, where exhibitions no longer concentrate on presentation or an end product, but focus instead on process and experience as spaces where things take place. Rather than sharing expertise, the role of a curator becomes that of enabling undetermined processes of collaborative knowledge production. Under the curatorial, knowledge is no longer treated as information. Instead, it is posed as a provocation. From this basis, and considering the conventional conception of mediation as the need to fill the gap in understanding between works and visitors, I propose working on rethinking mediation from a performative framework. We discussed the organizational distinction between curatorial and mediation teams at the museum, particularly concerning meaning-making processes. In very practical terms, where and when does mediation take place? Who is involved in the development of ideas and decision-making processes? What kind of boundaries need to come down? What work has already been done? For example, the museum constituencies were discussed as a way of starting a conversation and developing a project together. But also how to allow time for each show to unfold and redistribute and manage the staff's workloads. Our conversation was guided by the museum's interest in exploring the types of knowledge that the body can give rise to as a demodernizing methodology that moves away from Cartesian thinking. Barat draws attention to the asymmetrical faith in word over world, that is, the entrenched idea that representations, so meaning or content, are more accessible to us than the things they supposedly represent, the actual artworks in this case. Barat stresses that this is a historically and culturally contingent presumption, a Cartesian habit of mind. This is particularly relevant to the idea of demodernizing the museum. Attending to meaning-making processes in place is part of thinking beyond the mind and body modernist dichotomy. From the perspective of mediation, we talked about the museum's efforts to move away from answers and steer towards questions, as well as the difficulty of doing so in relation to visitors' expectations. The museum strives to introduce alternative ways of experiencing art that depart from the deeply rooted notion of the museum as an institution and the behavior expectations it carries. In this sense, for instance, programs such as Play were described as labor-intensive. We can think then, with Rogoff and von Bismarck, of exhibitions that work hard, in which the audience keeps working hard in a constant transformative process. They refer not only to the work of setting up an exhibition, but to open-ended exhibitions that continue to produce work. Conceived as an epistemic structure, the curatorial is concerned with the event of knowledge, as a performative interaction, a send-off without a predetermined outcome. In making space for indeterminacy, how to incorporate the material aspects of learning and the body's part in the production of meaning into the collection displays. Another central concern is making the gallery space more hospitable, a space where the body feels welcome and wants to move and make noise that can stall the urge to refer to language and understanding. In other words, how to extend the moment between experiencing the artwork and translating it into words. How to stay in this creative moment rather than falling back on language as a colonizing system that provides a sense of security. We started thinking then about ways of contextualizing and framing artworks, as well as questioning the kind of knowledge and learning put forward to the audience. We considered these issues in relation to the notion of unframed knowledge, which for Rogoff implies treating knowledge as a series of proposals or provocations rather than information. She refers to a back-and-forth fluid movement between exhibitions and the field of knowledge. Rogoff proposes working at the seams as a way of staying with the problematic. Seams are both a continuous matter and an opening up that inhabits and undermines strict boundaries between one thing and another. Delving into the experience of learning at the museum allows us to think of deviant alternatives. In Places of Learning, Elizabeth Ellsworth reminds us that knowledge, once it is defined, taught, and used as a thing made, is dead. It has been forced to give up to that which really exists, its nature when it is a thing in the making, continuously evolving through our understanding of the world and our own body's experience of and participation in that world. End of quote. Rethinking museum mediation from a performative framework can allow us to recover what Ellsworth calls thinking feeling. In her own words, the embodied sensation of making sense, the lived experience of our learning selves that make the thing we call knowledge. From this perspective, thinking and feeling ourselves as they make sense, the sensing of ourselves in the making, is posed as a root of what we call learning. We can think then of exhibitions in the making through our body's experience and interactions with the works and the gallery's environment. Feminist materialist pedagogies, and in particular diffractive pedagogies, have been instrumental in breaking through the gendered asymmetrical boundaries between meaning and matter, subject and object, thinking and feeling in the exhibition space. Our movement as learning session and the proposition to rethink mediation from a performative rather than representationalism framework are ways of moving away from the notion of knowledge as a tool of prediction and control and explore the more playful, pleasurable aspects of learning. The sessions at the Van Abbe put forward the value of feminist materialist pedagogies in framing deviant, more imaginative encounters with contemporary art. Thank you.
Good. remarks? Or
no, just
some moment for questions.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much, Anna. Are there already immediately questions? Can I see? Otherwise, I'll start off the conversation with a question of my own. No, because you did, let's say, looked at, let's say, the way we teach and mediate within the museum and how, let's say, the space is organized within that context, and that in a way, let's say, the moment of exchange, the moment of knowledge is in a way an encounter, an embodied encounter between, let's say, the thing and the subject, which is not a separate entity but is a connected moment.
Yeah.
And are there, let's say, out of your conversations, did you arrive at kind of, let's say, simple conclusions or let's say first ideas on, let's say, what could we do in different mediating or using these kind of insights in how to welcome or approach visitors to the institution?
Yeah, I didn't come up with like, concrete solutions like a handbook or, but I think one of the issues is, and actually, in your own question, it's not only the ways that we think that the museum is teaching, or so my research is more focused on, those kind of inherent pedagogies that are already in place in the exhibition space and that we don't think of them maybe in terms of learning. And I think that thinking them in this way, through a pedagogical perspective, kind of allows you to see kind of the structures in place and the positions that the visitors, perform in relation to the works and the objects, as well as the voice of the curator, and what kind of interpretive processes and meaning-making processes are allowed or encouraged. And so I think that a lot of those things are very, are considered the normal thing to do and what is already expected from museums. Very conventions that are just, followed and not particularly questioned. So I think that introducing a different pedagogical approach is, a way of deviating from that. Yeah.
So it requires in a way both a kind of an unlearning or an awareness of what we are already doing, and maybe a sensitivity to things that maybe are very small that we are doing but are not giving any credit to or not really recognizing as meaningful events within the museum. Yeah,
especially now with discourse about demodernizing and decolonizing the museum. I have found not only here but in many different institutions that maybe exhibitions address these ideas thematically, but then the meaning-making processes in place are still very modern and based on our modern understanding of education and learning. So it kind of reproduces, the same kind of relation and encounters with the artworks. So it's a way of moving away from that or troubling that.
So I'm looking at this. Okay, there are the first. Can one or the two want to? I thought I saw a third, but no. Good.
Yeah, thank you, Anna. It has been very interesting and inspiring, and I have about thousands of questions, but maybe just to start with one. I'm curious, it's a very general question, but how do you look at embodied learning? Like, what is it for you? Because, we are used to this very reductionist perspective of the body, and what I see already from a little bit that you showed from your work, that it's not just about physicality, right? It's senses, but emotional intelligence as emotions as a home, body as a home for emotions, or history, like talking about decolonization and personal decolonization. Like what do you like? Because there's so much, like there are so many subjects here. So how do you look at this?
Well, first I have to say that it's very difficult to move away from thinking and into the body. Like if you're not used to that. Actually, the work with Marie was very helpful in that, because she encouraged me to try things out. Like I was like, okay, I'm going to do this, and I had like a clear idea in my head, and it's, you know, she encouraged me to try things out with the body and how it feels actually, you know. And then we worked with the volunteers in the museum who are, you know, many hours in the museum and watching visitors moving in the galleries. And they were also very receptive and open of trying new things, you know. And well, the exercise, the movement as learning activity was just, you know, how to approach, if you approach the work and, you know, you immediately are in your mind and trying to interpret and, you know, so if you approach it with your body, what does your body want to do? Or, you know, and I mean, here the galleries and the exhibition design actually really, you know, sometimes it really allows that. But even if it doesn't, you know, there are still ways that your body interacts, not interacts, but I would say interacts, you know. And that's why I thought that the seminar session was also very important, because really mediation, I think, in most institutions is treated as a way of bridging the gap between objects and subjects, and, you know, so visitors and artworks. So, you know, if you start from a different standpoint and say, okay, if there's no gap, you know, if there is, you know, commonality between the two, then how that transforms thinking ways of mediation from the curatorial point of view as well. But we can talk after to discuss.
But I believe indeed that this could be expanded further upon, maybe also at the end of the session, but let's go to the second question.
Yeah, well, I actually have two questions, but I'll stick to one, maybe the other. I was wondering, within this bodily approach, how is like disabled versus abled dealt with in that context?
Yeah, well, we didn't particularly look into that. You know, that maybe is a very important aspect to think about. But in this case, it was very simple. You know, there were no restrictions. You know, in particular, like it was also forms. I think maybe it could be approached by thinking of, you know, just how your body wants or can move. It doesn't need, you know, it was not like you have to try a specific thing, you know. So for example, in the Sarah Wookie's project that I talked about, she proposed specific positions that you needed to try. And this was, you know, just kind of responding from your own body, you know. But I think that is a very interesting question that the museum is also working with, you know, also with the Multisensory Museum, for example. Yeah, but I didn't really look into that, but that's a good point that I should consider. Yeah.
Well, can I, sorry, then
yes.
Follow-up question would be, so how, maybe, yeah, you already said a little bit about it, but how the group that you showed some examples, like how did you select, or how did these people specifically?
So we have also another public session tomorrow. So anyone could, you know, interested could register for that. But in this case, we wanted to do a smaller session just to try out, you know, the activity. And so we thought that we invited the museum volunteers who wanted to sign up. And we thought, you know, their perspective was also very interesting, since they spent so much time in the gallery with the visitors and the works. And yeah, they just joined in. And I think also it's important to say that this activity I took from an article called Diffractive Pedagogies. And they apply this kind of movement as learning in the context of the university. So you have very different contexts. So I kind of adapted it to the museum, not really knowing, you know, what would happen. But yeah, I think it was a very refreshing way of approaching the works and the galleries. And yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. I think with that we're going to close this discussion now.